Good evening, everyone. It's Meir from Israel Now. It's a very important show. There was a horrific terror attack that occurred yesterday, that occurred today as well. Yesterday in Jenin, today in Eli. We're going to show something very shocking. And this show is primarily focused on a BDS supporter who has been invited to a synagogue in Toronto to degrade Rabbi Kahane, and at the same time he masquerades as an expert on Rabbi Kahane. He slips in support for the BDS. We're going to get into this tonight, but first we want to show you a shocking video of Arabs in the IDF, the Israeli army, who are praising the terrorist attack that occurred yesterday in Jenin, where Israeli soldiers were murdered. We'll show that, and that is something Rabbi Kahane was addressing, the threat of Arabs in Israel who don't recognize a Jewish state of any size that wish for the demise of Israel. These Arabs are in the IDF praising the terrorist attack, and thank God Itamar Ben-Gvir in the Knesset exposed this. Let's show the video.
جنين الله وجنين يعني لما قلت لهم جنين
الله وجنين والله ورب فلسطين دود كس اخت اسرائيل
ايوه اعطيهم والله غير سكور يجيبوا قوي عند الله
شيء شو فلسطين عم تقول لي احكي يسعد ربها فلسطين ولا بس قول لي هيك.
So Meir, thanks for joining us, Mayor Jolowitz. We've been involved with Rabbi Kahane for so many years. We commemorate the memory of Rabbi Kahane every year since he was murdered in 1990. We were heavily involved with the Jewish Defense League and spreading the ideology of Rabbi Kahane. We have this head case who's coming to Toronto. His name is Shaul Magid. He's been invited by the Bds-Supporting Synagogue in Toronto to degrade Rabbi Kahane. But this guy, let me first just mention something quickly about the synagogue. The Bds-Supporting Synagogue, what it was and what it is not any longer, it was one of the main synagogues in Toronto that would have rallies for Israel. And whenever there would be attacks in Israel, massive rallies for Israel in that synagogue. And in the 80s, big rallies for Soviet Jewry in the synagogue. The leadership has definitely changed in that synagogue, and it's heading towards, I believe, it has embraced egalitarianism. So now they invite this guy, Shaul Magid. A little bit of a background on Shaul Magid. He embraced some form of Hasidic Judaism in the 80s. It's according to his bio. He then gave that up. It wasn't for him anymore. Okay. And he started learning at the Bravender Yeshiva in Kiryat Moshe. Okay. Side note, Rabbi Bravender, who headed that yeshiva, who founded that yeshiva, he supported Rabbi Kahane, and he encouraged Libby Kahane, widow of Rabbi Kahane, to write a book that would document the life of Rabbi Kahane, and he encouraged her on. So then this guy, Shaul Magid, writes in his bio that after a few years there, or a couple of years at the Bravender Yeshiva, he gives up Orthodox Judaism. Okay. And then something happens in his life. He doesn't even explain it. But all of a sudden, he's praising groups such as the Jewish Voice for Peace, who embrace the BDS. Not only do they embrace the BDS, but they embrace the most extreme forms, if you could even say that, because the bottom line, they all want Israel wiped out. But the Jewish Voice for Peace, they support the Intifada. They say this. They look at Hamas and the Islamic Jihad as freedom fighters. They say Israel has no right to exist as a Jewish state. He lists Judith Butler, and he takes inspiration for her. She's with the Jewish Voice for Peace. And she joined, she made all kinds of statements. We provided information that we sent out. Canary Mission has a whole bio on her of the vulgar BDS activities she's with, such as the Global March on Jerusalem, throw the Jews out of Jerusalem. He praises Linda Sarsour, who is an avowed anti-Semite. Meir, you've read the stuff. You wrote an article last year about this head case, Shaul Magid. What could you say?
Let me begin with this. He's an intellectual fraud. He's also what he thinks is politically expedient. He sees that Israel has more foes than it has friends. He sees that any way of advancing in the academic world with these pseudo-intellectuals, this intelligentsia, which has for many, many, many decades been on the wrong side of right. And he decided that his future was best served there. Just a word of clarification, if I may, Meir, the little piece that we saw, those Arab soldiers in the IDF, a small number, but I just want to comment. They were referring to the incident in Jenin. Yes. IDF soldiers were not murdered. There were 7 of them were injured by a bomb. Okay. And it's interesting because Israel keeps talking about the fact that Jenin is not only the epicenter of terrorism that comes from that part of Israel, of the land of Israel, but it also represents almost an island extension of Iran and its activities there. We will link the two. The Shaul Magid, as you mentioned, this professor at Dartmouth, he's not new to this. When I say he's not new to this, he's been doing this for more than half a decade. And by doing this, I mean he's been switching sides. He realizes that he finds greater comfort with the academic world, which is pro-BDS, which is pro-Palestine. The fact that there were, as we mentioned, that corollary story, soldiers, Arab soldiers in the IDF, it needs to be put in perspective. There was a spokesman who came around. He's the representative of American Friends for the IDF. And he was collecting a lot of money. And he was trying to do it in what I consider to be a very perverse way. He was talking about the fact that even Arabs in Israel serve in the IDF, and we should contribute to the IDF because, well, when these Arabs are done with their service, we'd like to do job placement and everything else. Well, we just saw some of those Arabs. But to give perspective to the situation, if I'm not mistaken, I think the Israeli standing army is about 174,000 strong. The number of Arabs who actually serve in the IDF is less than 700. So this perspective needs to be placed in its proper place because people would otherwise think that Arabs and Jews alike serve in the Israeli Defense Forces, and these guys were just an aberration. They're not. They're not. And the fact that it was in Arabic, but the fact that they were mocking the IDF's attempts to quiet the Arabs and the terrorism comes from Jenin. They praised Palestine. They extended their support for Palestine. And in doing so, they threw a very ubiquitous curse word in Arabic, which is much too vile for me to interpret, but it's probably the filthiest thing that one can say of one's adversary. And they said it about Jews, about Israelis. So let's put that in perspective. Rabbi Kahane, many years ago, because you mentioned Rabbi Kahane, when he was banished when he was banned from running for the Knesset after having been elected in 1984. In 1988, the polls showed him with a commanding presence, enough that he was going to get 11, 12, or perhaps even 13, according to Israeli newspapers, Idiot Achronot and also Ma'ariv, which would have made him at the time the third largest party. And because he was a threat to the Israeli government, because he was criticizing Israel for not recognizing that there was, in fact, a potential fifth column, and we just saw evidence of it now, a potential fifth column, he was banned from running in 1988. At the same time, there was an Arab party, which was very cleverly called the Progressive Peace Party of Mohammed Meir, and they were supposed to be banished as well, incitement. They didn't recognize the state of Israel. Mohammed Meir said that he took his orders from Arafat, and the rabbi said something very clever at the time, which was disturbing to those of us who knew that he was right. He said, one day, and that day is going to come, in the Knesset, you're going to have to choose. It's either Kahane or Arafat. One of us is going to sit in the Knesset. Now, one could argue that Itamar Ben-Gvir is, in fact, someone who sort of follows the teachings of Rabbi Kahane. His opponents certainly wish to make that connection. But if you want to talk about which camp is strongest, because the last Israeli government, that leftist government, was formed as a coalition. I'm talking about the Bennett-Lapid Benny Gantz party. The only reason they were able to actually put together a coalition was because for the first time an Arab party actually joined the coalition. Well, that little piece that that Gary and that you showed of just a few minutes before shows you exactly what that harmony is among the Israeli Arabs. Not to ignore, of course, the fact that every time that there is a bombing in Israel, that there's a stabbing in Israel, that there's a car ramming in Israel, that there is a shooting in Israel, and I want to mention the shooting in a second, we see towns in Israel. We're not talking about in the so-called occupied territories. In Israel, where there's a tremendous celebratory mood on the part of the Arabs, celebrating the fact that they have resisted the IDF and they've struck against the Zionists. Innocent men, women, and children in the street, shooting them. One last comment. The IDF came out today, as they did yesterday, as they did a week ago, as they did a month ago, as they did 6 months ago, and said they're not going to tolerate this anymore. Well, they are tolerating it. Apparently, they think that the economy is more important. They need their Arab workers, what have you. But Israel announced quite joyfully, and I hate to say it, but quite joyfully, that they confiscated, that they raided someplace in the territories and confiscated 5 guns. I need to give a little perspective to this. According to the Israeli intelligence apparatus, the Arabs who are Israel's enemies in Israel, in the land of Israel, have access to over 400,000 guns. And the IDF announces this morning the success that they were able to raid someplace and confiscate 5 weapons, 5 guns. And you realize, as we have done in this broadcast before, it's almost like we're the people, Cassandra. We're the ones saying, people, wake up. It's not what you think. Everyone is talking about the Saudis and the Israelis are going to, there's going to be some kind of rapprochement of sorts and all that nonsense. And every day, another Jew is attacked, another Jew is murdered. We remember the names. Today, we know the names. It was Ofer, it was Ophir, it was Harel, I've got it here, Nachman, and it was Elisha. 4 Israelis whose names were unknown to us just 36 hours ago. And tomorrow, the Israeli public will bury 4 of its finest because an Arab with a gun decided to walk into a restaurant at a gas station in Israel and open fire. And once again, the IDF came out. Bibi Netanyahu called a press conference, and he said, and he was right, he said, we always get the perpetrators. We always get the perpetrators. They immediately neutralized the first one, and they have subsequently neutralized the second. And if anyone considers that to be a victory, the fact that Arab terrorists, after they murder Jews, are always gotten, I'm sorry, to me, that's not a victory. It's not a victory. It's a tragedy that they were there in order to perpetrate the murders, and it will, and when we speak again, Meir, whenever that might be, it will happen again and again.
And the Best Synagogue in Toronto is inviting this person, Shaul Magid, where they are going to be talking about that the Jews are wrong, that our claims are wrong, that we should feel sorry for, in quotations, the poor Palestinians, that we have brought about this so-called Nakba. We have a short video to show to expose this flake, Shaul Magid, who and he's actually getting paid to speak there at the synagogue.
Can I just mention very
we have
quickly?
The short video that's put together. Yes, absolutely.
Just very quickly, for those out there who don't speak Hebrew, and I think perhaps most do, I think you said it's called Bds-Supporting is the name of the synagogue. The House of Justice.
Right.
Translate, the House of Justice. That said, let's watch it.
They should really have a memorial service in the synagogue for what just happened with these terror attacks, but they're inviting the exact opposite.
That's right.
I'm going to say a couple of comments, and you guys are welcome to butt in any time, and I could pause this very short video. It's about 5 minutes, but being unfamiliar with this gentleman, and I will not refer him to as Rabbi, I think that he forfeited that title years ago, but just a little bit about him on a special report. As mentioned, a Toronto synagogue, and you'll notice it's a Toronto synagogue, which right out front has a Christmas tree. So it's pretty easy to know which synagogue we're talking about. I'm surprised there's not a little, Star of Bethlehem on top of it. And I didn't Photoshop that. That was there. It just kind of, so, Bds-Supporting, not to be confused with Tzaddik. So this gentleman, which I use the word, is they're hosting this self-proclaimed anti-Jewish state, pro-BDS, anti-IRA definition. Now, I just found out recently, that the International Global Consortium of Imams has accepted the IRA definition? Now, could you believe that? But he doesn't. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
He looks like Emperor Ming from the old Flash Gordon serials.
Yeah, that's insulting that person from Flash Gordon. So he's coming in to discuss Rabbi Meir Kahane? I mean, really? So Shaul Magid is discussing Meir Kahane. You got to be kidding. I mean, that itself is comical as satirical. Sounds like Saturday Night Live. So he's transgressed over decades of decadence. It didn't just happen overnight. He first had these Haredi inclinations, and then he had these orthodoxy observances, and then he became what he is today. And he epitomizes, in honor of our esteemed guest, special guest's favorite quote from none other than Pogo. We've met the enemy, and he is us. No shit, Sherlock. I mean, that he is the enemy. I mean, he makes the BDS group seem like gentlemen. So this is on his public. Now, I need to say, this isn't a private page. This is his public Facebook page with over 4,000 followers. And keep in mind, some of these followers are impressionable Jewish teens who are 13, 14, 15 years old. When their parents make sure they're not looking at porn on the internet, this is worse than porn. They could be following this character. So this is his Facebook page. He's very proud of some of his accomplishments. This is on his Facebook page, right? I mean, Palestinian flags and stop funding, Bibi and his fascist friends. So imagine a 16-year-old who's in high school is searching around for rabbis, finds this guy, and this is, it is really is the Shana of the year. So he condemns Netanyahu. That's not bad enough. He displays Palestinian flags. And then he also celebrates marijuana use. Now, I'm not commenting on the legalization, the use, the not use of marijuana. Just like I wouldn't promote cigarettes or alcohol on my Facebook page because of impressionable youngsters, he thinks it's funny to celebrate marijuana. And I didn't even notice. Did you know that the numbers 420 signifies National Marijuana Day? I never knew that. I learned it on his Facebook page.
It also happens to be Hitler's birthday.
Right, exactly. It's Hitler's birthday. It's also the date that some stoners in California, instead of going to a football game at 20 past 4 in the afternoon, they started to smoke weed. But again, this is all well and good for us pseudo adults, but for kids to be thinking this is funny, that's the problem. So, I always thought that the concept of rabbis was to be a good impression on us and our children. My opinion growing up in my household was that he confuses the Second Amendment. I like the Second Amendment, but he thinks this is what it means to bear arms. So, what can I say? He's confused on the Constitution as well. Moving right along. Rabbis are supposed to, in my humble opinion, set an example, a good example. They're supposed to be an example. They're supposed to be an example that we admire and that our children look up to. Rabbis should be raising the bar, not drinking at the bar 24/7 and not lowering it. Look at who we admire. We admire Haredi rabbis, Schneerson, a conservative rabbi at the Park Avenue Synagogue in New York. And of course, the Reform rabbis, Rabbi Emilio Hirsch. I have no choice, but I'm going to give you 1 minute of Rabbi Hirsch, what he has to say to people like this pseudo-rabbi.
Bleeding hearts who have no heart for bleeding Jews.
He's Reform rabbi.
It's all academic for them. We should have the courage, the decency, the honesty to say that our side, the liberal side, is wrong.
I think that our person we're speaking about tonight should take heed in that notice.
Allow me to,
Rabbi Meir Kahane.
Allow me to interject. It was Rabbi Kahane who said about Reform rabbis, he said the only reason Reform rabbis in America have a job is that they actually had the good fortune to find a congregation of Jews who know less than Judaism than they did.
Exactly. Exactly. And this Rabbi Hirsch at the Steve Weiss Synagogue in New York, he actually on Rosh Hashanah got up and lectured his progressive audience on how they need to support Israel. So again, in honor of Rabbi Meir Kahane is tonight's program. I'm going to turn it back over to you two. And just while you're watching and sharing this on YouTube or Facebook, please do support us. Go to israelnow.ca. Without any further ado, I'm out of here.
So, Meir, like about a year ago, I found out about this guy, and I shared some information with you, and you looked it up. You did research. You wrote an article which appeared in the Jewish press, and we thought he's just pretty much on the left. He doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to Rabbi Kahane. And now we looked into it a little bit more deeply, and we find his associations with the BDS fully, with the Jewish Voice for Peace, with Linda Sarsour, with praises an Arab university professor that was an advocate against the existence of the State of Israel. What is that professor's name?
Edward Said.
Edward Said praises him, looks up to these people. He tries to make the argument also that the majority of Jews prior to the Holocaust were not so supportive of Zionism. And, like he falsifies history, the reality of history. Theodor Herzl was not a religious Jewish guy. He was for assimilation, saw that, or conversion even to Christianity, saw that as how to avoid anti-Semitism. And then the Dreyfus trial, well, he was covering that. Dreyfus, who had no attachment to Judaism, he saw that case and he saw the hatred in France for Jews. And he wrote his book, The Jewish States. And that was the beginning of the political Zionist movement. And it resonated with Jews. And especially when we came to the period of the Holocaust, it was a no-brainer for Jews that they saw that the gates were closed in every country. And the argument of Zionism and setting up a Jewish state in our ancestral homeland resonated fully with Jewish people. He falsifies everything that Shaul, Magid. Meir, what could you add?
Just to play off something that Gary said a few minutes before, when Gary mentioned about the possible impact, the very negative impact that he would have on our youth today. You shared with me today a speech that he had given before. I had, in fact, I did write a piece which appeared in Israel National News when he had tried to vilify the rabbi before.
Right.
It's interesting because I think the more dangerous place that he is found is at the academic level. He's with the Hartman. He's from Dartmouth. He is introduced as a professor. He very much wants to join this. There's a jury out there that sits in condemnation of everything that Israel does, and he wants so much to be part of the Norman Finkelsteins, the Peter Beinarts, the Noam Chomskys. He very much wants to be part. He wants to be considered one of these we call them pseudo-intellectuals who criticize Israel because they realize that that's where the game is now played. In academia, Israel is vilified. Mind you, these people will say nothing negative. The Finkelsteins, the Beinarts, and the Chomskys say nothing about the fact that Arab terrorists roam freely. That isn't their concern. In that piece that you shared with me today, it was interesting. He was trying to do an academic piece. And the people that I'm afraid whose minds he's going to somehow warp because they just don't know and they think that he is an intellectual voice are the people that I saw sitting in the audience there at the university level who seem to think that what he says has some kind of validity because he's got credentials, that he's a professor, that he's written about this and such. And it's nonsense. He's a fool. He knows nothing about the subject that he talks about. Now, it's interesting because in one of the segments of the piece that you sent me that I watched, he talked about the fact that in 1937, he was talking about the shift of American Jews, how they once weren't Zionists, and they decided to become Zionists. And obviously, because of the Holocaust, there was a certain empathy which was developed for Israel. And he basically said, what is it? What's the one common denominator that makes us all, which puts us all under the same umbrella? And his comment was, it's Judaism. And he went on to say, however you celebrate it, however you practice it, whatever discipline it is, whatever you think of Judaism, that is the umbrella that unites us. Everyone has a right to celebrate or to practice Judaism as they wish. And the obvious question would be, would that apply to the Jews for Jesus as well? Very simple question. Does that apply for the Jews or just the liberal element? He then went on to talk about the fact that whereas Judaism is a religion which praises justice and brotherhood, and he gave a lot of nonsensical examples of which it's nothing more than modern-day pseudo-intellectualism. What he basically said was that there's no more place for Zionism. If there's one common denominator, if there's one thing which is endemic to the practice of Judaism, it is Zion. It's Zionism. Zionism is nothing more and nothing less than the Jewish national liberation movement. That's what it is. Peoples all over the world are celebrated and applauded for having their own national liberation movement, except for the Jews. And he has joined that chorus. What we see here is a jury out there that condemns Israel. It's a kangaroo court. And he very much wants to have a seat with the people that I've mentioned. In 2017, Professor Edward Alexander wrote a brilliant book and a very disturbing book. I had the good fortune to spend some time with Professor Alexander before he passed, well, many years ago, actually. Brilliant man. And he wrote a book called Jews Against Themselves, 2017. It's a short book. It's 179 pages. It's a read for those people who want to know about the Shaul Magids of this world, even though I don't think he's mentioned in there, about these people who are the self-haters, these charlatans who basically call themselves Jews only as license to attack Israel. The reason they call themselves Jews or identify as Jews isn't because they're practitioners or believers and what have you. That's nonsense, because everything he speaks about is the antithesis of what Judaism is. What he does is he says, I'm a Jew, and therefore I have license and I have the mantle to be able to criticize the state of Israel, and he does so by attacking Zionism. It needs to be exposed. It needs to be exposed because Zionism, and he almost proudly, he now makes an intellectual case where Israel is no longer central to Judaism, which is the complete negation of what Judaism is. That Zionism is the essence. It's the cornerstone. It's the foundation of everything that is Jewish. Whether you are a practitioner or not, one must recognize the centrality of Israel to the Jewish people, the Jewish religion. He can choose not to, but he can't suggest that we don't have a right to do that. And that's what he does. He's a fraud. He's an intellectual fraud. He's not an intellectual. He's a fraud. And he gets away with it because, to use that quote that I mentioned before, he actually lectures and speaks to, including the media, an audience that knows less than he does, and he capitalizes on that. This is not a type of person. He wrote a book attacking Rabbi Kahane, and he mentions in it, he says, I never had occasion to meet the rabbi, but, and then he does a psychoanalysis of him. Well, I never had occasion to meet Shaul Magid, and I can guarantee you that my psychoanalysis of his pathological disorder, his pathological psychosis, would be more accurate than his of the rabbi.
Really makes you wonder about someone who, on the one hand, tries to embrace a Hasidic brand of Judaism, and mentions the rabbi that he followed then. That was pretty far out there, very acidic and restrictive of all kinds of food as well as all kinds of things. And then he gives up that lifestyle, and then he gravitates to the Brabender yeshiva. That, I don't know, I guess you could call it more modern orthodoxy, but I really wouldn't use that label. They're fully Orthodox there, because that yeshiva was pretty much across the road from the yeshiva I attended, Meir. And I knew some of the students there at Rabbi Brabender's yeshiva. And then all of a sudden, for reasons he doesn't disclose, he chucks Orthodoxy completely, and he's bashing Israel. And he's embracing Jews who hate Israel,
Right.
preach an intifada, who embrace organizations that celebrate terrorist leaders and terrorist attacks. The Jewish Voice for Peace works hand in hand with American Muslims for Palestine, works hand in hand with Linda Sarsour that says, let's go after the synagogues. All kinds of Jew haters that they work with. In fact, they just made a statement yesterday condemning Israel for a response to the attack in Jenin. So that's the Jewish Voice for Peace. On his Facebook page, where he shares a picture of Palestine flags, the current rabbi at that synagogue, the best tzedek, I monitor various chat groups also from J Street and J Space and all these losers who believe in a Palestine state in our community. But on one of the chat groups, they're with some group called XPAC, some group of Israelis on the left in North America that are protesting against the current government in Israel. And they have no problem with Palestine flags. So they have a branch here in Toronto, and on their chat group, they're boasting about the fact that the rabbi at the synagogue is encouraging Jews who are in those circles with J Space and J Street, and those who are protesting against the government to come and attend this event that he considers to be a very important event with Shaul Magid. Now, I could tell you that the previous rabbis who were at that synagogue, when there would be rallies for Israel, major rallies for Israel, I knew these rabbis. And if I would show them just that picture of Shaul Magid boasting about the Palestine flag and supporting that and supporting Jewish Voice for Peace, these rabbis in a minute or less than a minute would make sure that he is not setting foot in that synagogue at all. It's completely outrageous, and that's the direction that synagogue is going. Unfortunately, now it's a very large synagogue, but it has embraced now this egalitarianism, which embraces BDS organization under the so-called pseudo-intellectual argument that they have.
Yeah, allow me this also about Magid. A number of years ago, what he did in his pursuit of his reputation in the academic world, he saw that academia, especially in the Western world, was very much anti-Israel. Israel was no longer considered the David surrounded by Goliath, but Israel was indeed the Goliath that now was challenging the Palestinian David. Shaul Magid is someone who doesn't view the conflict in the Middle East as the Arab war against Israel, or more broadly stated, the Muslim war against the Jew. Shaul Magid views it as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and he chooses to go with the underdog. He seems to like, but he does so only after he takes his finger, and he puts it up to the air, and he gauges where the intellectual wind stream is going, the way he views it, and he sees that it's anti-Israel. Magid, he has spoken in the past, and he speaks almost admirably about someone who was in fact an intellectual, a great philosopher, but who was clearly mistaken many centuries ago, Spinoza. Spinoza was considered a brilliant Jewish mind, whatever, a heretic of sorts. But nonetheless, Magid sees himself as, I'm going to do the circuit, and that's where he does. He goes out, he does a circuit. He appears on Zoom broadcasts. He appears in synagogues, the kind that you've described. He appears on television programs. He presents his credentials, tied loosely to a couple of think tanks. He is represented, of course, a professor at Dartmouth University, and therefore his credentials seem legitimate. And he brings up these, what is viewed by the media as controversial issues, Israel versus the Arabs, Rabbi Meir Kahane's reputation, and he, having put his finger to the wind, understands that he will become popular when he takes the position that you've described, this viciously anti-Israel position, and quite openly embraces those people who basically call for the destruction of the state of Israel. And he views it as he presents himself, and he boasts, by the way, when I mentioned the Chomskys and the Peter Beinarts and everything else, he praises them as clear thinkers who are the brave intellectuals of today.
Right.
And as I said, he wants a place at that table. In reality, as I said, he's a loser. He's truly a loser. He's a charlatan. But the thing is, that's an opinion that's recognized by people who know what's going on. And tragically, that number, the people who really know what's going on, it's a finite group. It's a smaller number. It's a smaller number than it ought to be. And I mean, when I watched today, and I've seen in the past, I've seen at least 5 or 6 of his interviews. When he was speaking, for example, about justifying why he wrote the book, I, in an op-ed, actually facetiously said the reason he wrote the book is because there was a couple of mortgage payments behind, and he decided that he was going to publish a book, which a publishing house would be happy to grab, and he does this diatribe against Rabbi Meir Kahane. And it's remarkable because those of us who knew him, if you could imagine a discussion, a debate between the Rabbi Kahane and this imp, this insignificant imp, it's laughable. So what does he do? He just understands that the audience is found with what he preaches, and he decides to preach, and he's getting a wide audience. He's getting a wide audience. It's a tragic thing. What he's also capitalizing on, to come back to the film the quick film that we saw in the beginning, to put those two pieces together. In Israel, we've seen now for 25 consecutive weeks demonstrations by the opposition. The opposition, the parties that lost in the last election, the parties, to clarify, that lost in a democratic election, and they refuse to recognize the fact that they have lost, and they have begun, from inside, these are Israelis, they've begun to demonize Israel, and they get their support from around the Western world, the European Union, and the Biden administration. Today, there was an interview in Israeli television with former Justice Minister Chaim Ramon. Chaim Ramon is a liberal leftist. Lately he's come across and discovered some of that missing common sense, and he said some things which has disturbed the left, the liberal left. Appearing in Channel 14 in Israel, which is the only conservative, I guess one would say, television station in Israel. All the others are far left. He came out and he criticized Israel's leftist newspaper, Haaretz. Haaretz is considered in Israel to be the intellectual newspaper, the New York Times of Israel, and it's viciously anti-Israel. Haaretz came out with an editorial which basically said that the time has come for soldiers, particularly soldiers in the reserves, to question whether or not they should respond to a call-up when the Israeli government, when the IDF calls them up to do their service. And Haaretz actually said a person should not automatically respond to it. They should judge the situation case by case and decide whether or not Israel is worth defending. And Chaim Ramon, a former leftist, a liberal, came out and said, this is as dangerous a thing as we have ever seen. That the media and the intellectual media, again in quotation, the intellectual media has actually charged the soldiers, resist. If you resist, we can bring this government down. The Shaul Magid sitting in the Western world, he doesn't have a dog in the race. His children don't have to go into bomb shelters when rockets are falling from Gaza. His children aren't going to have to worry about a possible or an impending Iranian nuclear capability, military capability. So he sits in the Ivy League towers, and what does he do? He criticizes Israel because he sees that he's got support not only in the academic element of the Western world, but in Israel as well. And as I've said before in this broadcast, and it pains me to say it, we're in trouble. We are in trouble. And the reason I say it ever more strongly than I used to before was because the side that we ostensibly sit with, the conservatives, the right-wingers and everything else, we see too often beginning to capitulate to some of the pressures that are brought to bear by the UN, by the European Union, by the Biden administration. We see that too often. Yesterday, Antony Blinken came out in contradiction of what was stated by Biden just 10 months ago, that the United States would support Taiwan if China, the communist China, would ever attack them. Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, came out and basically reneged and said, the United States doesn't recognize the independent Taiwan, doesn't recognize it. And it was almost a signal to the Chinese. And it reminds me, because once again, we brought in the name of Rabbi Meir Kahane. Rabbi Meir Kahane, many years ago, 1967, wrote a book that most people don't even realize was ever written. It was written by Meir Kahane, Michael King, which was actually a pseudonym of his, nom de guerre, and also Joseph Sherba. And the name of the book was The Jewish Stake in Vietnam. Right. The Jewish Stake in Vietnam. Well, what's the Jewish stake in Vietnam? And basically, it was a message. It basically said, those countries out there in the Western world who have an alliance, or at least a tacit understanding of a cooperation with the United States, and he was referring to Israel. He's referring to Israel. And he said, look what the Americans did to their South Vietnamese alliance. They betrayed them. And he said at the time, he wrote at the time, the day will come, if you allow your future to be determined by the American government, you will be betrayed. And here it is, Antony Blinken sends a message to China.
Right.
It should have been heard as loudly in Israel, and it wasn't. That, yes, we will talk the talk. In Hebrew, there's an expression, it's the talk, it's paka paka. We are paka paka. Yeah,
Right.
the Americans say the right thing. We will stand with Israel. We will allow Israel. And then they put the knife in Israel's back. Israel needs to wake up. Is this reversible? It's immediately reversible. Get rid of the administration in Washington and it's reversible. But we need to pay attention. We need to pay attention because it's not heading in the right direction.
Correct, 100%. Well, I'm going to be attending that event Thursday night, and I'll wait for my opportunity that I could present the facts to expose this dangerous clown, Shaul Magid.
That's what he is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Meir, let me thank you for joining us. Always a pleasure. We'll do it again, but we got the word out, and I'm asking everyone who watches, either watching us live tonight or who will receive the YouTube link, if you could please share this with the various platforms that you use, be it YouTube, WhatsApp groups, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We'd appreciate it. We'll reach a lot more people. Thank you very much, Meir, for joining us, and we'll take it up another time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.